Hoop fam, what's going on? We back at it. Good to see you all. Good to see you all. Hope everybody's healthy and hope everybody's staying safe. I know I say that a lot, but I mean that. I certainly mean that. Appreciate you joining, Jeff. Thank you. We'll wait for a couple more people to get on before we start. Hope everybody's doing well out there for sure. All right, I'm getting ready to get into it. So again, hope everybody's healthy, hope everybody's safe. Thank you for joining, and want to take some time to talk about the last two episodes of The Last Dance. There's a lot to unpack here. A lot happened, a lot to discuss. I certainly have my thoughts. Hoop fam, if you have any questions, any thoughts, feel free to chime in, and I will certainly address those also too. So when we started out, of course, we started out with that 98 NBA All-Star game where Kobe and Mike were matched up in that All-Star game, and it was Kobe's first appearance in the All-Star game, being the youngest starter in the history of All-Star games at that point, and as well as it shaping up to people speculating whether or not if it was going to be Michael's last All-Star game. And of course, it had to take place at Madison Square Garden. It couldn't have been scripted better. It seems like, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about the great Michael Jordan, of course, is timing. His career sort of coincided with the beginning of his prime, sort of coincided with the end of the Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas sort of prime years. So he was positioned well to accept that mantle and take over and become the face of the league. So again, timing here as well. What was his last All-Star game in a Bulls uniform, and people thought it was his last ever. Again, matching up with Kobe's first, and it being in New York City was incredible from a timing standpoint. So that was awesome, and it was great to see. And also one of the things that was awesome to see as well was Kobe's sort of his approach to the game and how that mirrored Michael's approach to the game. And, oftentimes we see with these all-time greats, their approach to the game is the same. And they don't leave their fate up to sort of chance. They don't leave it up to chance. They take their fate into their own hands, and they don't have dreams. One of the things I like to say is they take their dreams and turn them into goals. So they don't have dreams, they have goals. And once you have those goals, you accomplish those goals. And a dream sort of elicits the thought of a fantasy, something that I can't attain. And these players certainly turned their dreams into goals, and they did that through the work. They were native to that platform of success through the work, and they were able to replicate that through the fundamentals. So that was something that really resonated with me. And you watch Michael talking about Kobe, saying that this young guy is going to take it. He's not going to wait for it. And it was interesting to see Michael talk about Kobe in that regard, because I'm sure as Michael was making his ascent in his first All-Star game was 13 years before in 1985, as he was making his ascent, I am sure that the other players that were already established stars thought of Michael in the same way. Yeah, this young guy he's going to take it. He's not going to wait for the moment. And Michael was also letting you know that the day after he got drafted, when he did his press conference with the Bulls, and he said, if I have anything to do with it, this franchise will be in the playoffs every single year that I'm in a Bulls uniform. And that was a big statement coming from a rookie, coming to a team that was terrible. And so his approach as well was, I'm going to take it, and I'm not going to wait. So it was interesting to see Michael now being on the other side of that table and seeing a player that was sort of cut from the same cloth as him with the same mentality. And, it was interesting listening to Kobe as well, talking about people pitting Kobe and Michael against each other and who's better. And Kobe so eloquently saying that if there were no Michael, there would be no me. So all of the things that basketball is artistry, and the way that Kobe expressed himself on the floor, that art was coming from Michael, and it was an iteration of Michael Jordan. So it was great for him to acknowledge that, and Kobe being the basketball savant that he is, and also being secure in himself and his accomplishments on the floor. It was great to see that he acknowledged Michael and Michael's contributions, and also Michael's effect on Kobe as well as a player. So one of the other things that I thought was great also is, I've talked about this before with Kobe. I don't think those 3 air balls that he shot in the playoffs against Utah, I don't think those 3 air balls motivated him at all. I think Kobe's motivation came from his intrinsic idea of, I want to be the best player that I can be. So Kobe was going to reach that level regardless. I don't think he relied on any sort of outward motivation. And when I was working as a writer or a scout at ESPN, if I would have written, hey, Kobe is not a good shooter, I don't think that would have motivated him at all. So Kobe, again, because if you watch him throughout his career, he very rarely referenced those air balls. Now, it could have been, they were so painful that I just put them away. But oftentimes players, when they're asked about what motivates them, they talk about these seminal moments that happen throughout their career. And Kobe never made mention of those air balls at all. And the other thing that was interesting to note as well, while they were competing in the All-Star game, and I remember watching that game, and they were certainly competing. While they were competing and they were matched up on each other, Kobe asked Michael questions about footwork in the post, etc. And that here is a 19-year-old Kobe Bryant who, at that point, had what I call the proverbial cheat code in terms of his greatness. He was athletic, he was long, he had all of those things that naturally would make you a great player. And he was asking about things that he could replicate, things that would make him native to that platform of success that I always talk about. He wanted to be grounded in those fundamentals because he also knew at some point, if I'm going to continue to dominate this league and I'm going to continue to replicate my dominance, it has to be based more so on the fundamentals and less so on the athleticism that he possessed as a player. So him asking those questions and Michael being receptive to Kobe asking those questions was also interesting, because here's Michael, who referenced throughout those episodes that he needed to sort of, whether it was real or contrived, he needed to make things up to to keep his motivation so he could go out and attack the opposition. Here it is, the next guy that's coming, and Michael acting as a resource for him. That almost indicated to me that was game recognized game, where Michael recognized that, yeah, this young guy is not waiting for it, but this young guy is good enough to accept the baton, so to speak, and be the next guy in line. And Michael respected that. So it was certainly game recognized game, and Michael working as a resource for Kobe was great to see. And, for all of us and it's great that we have these debates, but for all of us that have these debates, it was certainly great to see these two all-time greats talking about sharing knowledge and working as a resource, etc. So it was great to see that. It was great to see the emergence of the young Kobe as well, and the things that he sort of gained from Michael's presence, Michael's game, from observing, and then asking him also too. So great for these two uber competitive guys to work in tandem to achieve greatness. So now moving on, I certainly want to talk about the branding power of a Nike and the brand presence, the brand loyalty that Nike has established in the market, how that came about. And Michael Jordan's is largely responsible for Nike emerging as a brand bigger than basketball. Because one thing I'll tell you from my experience working in basketball sports marketing at Nike, about 80% of the basketball and running footwear that's engineered and purchased by consumers is not used for the purposes it was engineered for. So soccer moms are buying running shoes because they're comfortable. People are buying basketball shoes because they're fashion statements now. And when Michael came, when the Jordan came, it was so visually arresting that it became a fashion statement. And Nike leveraged that to success in all sorts of other areas and avenues. I mean, after they had the Nike Air Jordan, I remember as a consumer, Nike would put Nike Air on a sweatshirt, and I would buy that hoodie because it said Nike Air on it. And that was, in my mind, tied to Michael Jordan. And I know that I wasn't alone in that thinking. And, you know, when you start thinking about that brand presence, he actually helped establish Nike as this cultural phenomenon. And you wonder, yes, he has the Jumpman logo, but how much of those earnings did he really participate in? And that's something for another topic for another day. But it's certainly something that I wanted to touch on and talk about. And also talk about the fact of the matter is, when you look at what we call urban culture, which is African American culture, that our culture sort of permeates the culture for the world. The things that we adopt as trends and fashion statements ultimately end up being fashion statements and trends for the entire world. And of course, Nike rode this wave when they had Michael Jordan, when they had Bo Jackson. And especially when you take Bo Jackson, who was a football, baseball guy, and they transformed him into this cultural figure as well. So certainly want to take some time to recognize that. And when you look at that power of the brand and Nike being an upstart at the time, it's hard to believe Nike is almost a $50 billion company now. And it's hard to believe that Nike was an upstart at one point in time. And when you look at when you make it relative to the age of companies, it wasn't that long ago that Nike was actually an upstart. And Adidas and Converse and Reebok were the established sort of basketball brands. And you look at the fact how one little happening can change the entire basketball culture, the basketball world as we know it, and as well as the sneaker world as we know it. If Michael Jordan's mother didn't make him take the meeting with Nike, who knows what would have happened. So in essence, Michael Jordan's mother plays a large role in making Nike this pop culture icon that we know it as right now. And so again, you have to ask, with that, how much of those earnings did she participate in, given the fact that she had such a major impact on the growth and explosion of this cultural icon that we know as Nike, that sort of transcends athletic apparel and is now a cultural icon that makes statements in a multitude of different areas. And as we talk about that as well, certainly want to talk about one of my favorites when I was a Bulls fan watching them play, living in LA, is Craig Hodges, three-time NBA champion, NBA three-point champion, three-time champion as well. And he actually wanted to use his platform because he is watching the cultural impact of a Michael Jordan and watching what's going on. He felt like we should actually use our platform to make social change, to impact the lives of people that may not have a voice. Sound familiar? Colin Kaepernick, right? also Muhammad Ali, etc. So Craig Hodges was on these teams as well and played a major part on these teams and wanted Michael to actually use his platform to be more of a spokesperson to affect change and on the African American communities in particular, given the fact that our community was originally holding Michael up as this cultural icon and buying his shoes. I can tell you, when you wore Jordans back in the time when I wore them, it was a cultural statement. People thought they looked like space shoes. They weren't shoes that everybody wore. They were red and black. So they made an actual statement. I remember wearing them and I would walk around and people would actually look at my feet. And whether they thought they looked great, whether they thought they were hideous. Nonetheless, it was a cultural statement to wear Jordans during that time. It wasn't this mainstream it didn't have that mainstream effect that we see now where everybody buys them, especially as they've now retroed and that there's a whole different audience there. So Michael had this effect and Craig wanted to use that platform to bring about change for everybody. And very important to mention because Michael's stance on that was, and he said that in jest, that Republicans buy shoes as well. And it's so ironic how in 2020, with the advent of social media, we almost demand that if we're going to pay a premium for a particular athlete's product, or if they're endorsing a product and asking the consumer to pay a premium for that product, we almost demand, whether it's Twitter with 140 characters, whether it's just a picture on Instagram, we almost demand that we know something about that athlete. We need to know something about your platform. We need to know something about what you represent. What are the things that you actually like to endorse, whether the things that are near and dear to your heart. That is so different than in 1985 when Michael actually, and David Falk to a certain extent, buffaloed Nike, and as Nike was the upstart, and they viewed themselves as we are the established commodity here. We are the established person here. So you will have to pay for our services if you don't want us to go to Adidas or Converse. And one of the interesting things about that is I found was as much as David Falk, Michael Jordan's agent, flexed his muscle and leveraged Michael as a player and said, hey, you guys are the upstart. We're the more established brand here. I found it interesting that he didn't do that as much with the Chicago Bulls when he was negotiating Michael's basketball contract. And, again, as I said on one of our previous lives here, Scottie Pippen had he signed the deal that he signed because of the fact that Michael signed an 8-year, $25 million deal. So he actually set the market in terms of what the other players on the Bulls were able to sign for, because nobody was going to sign for a higher contract or a higher amount than Michael Jordan. So that sort of forced Scottie to sign at the level that he signed at. So I found it a little bit interesting that David Falk didn't exercise that same leverage as Michael became a more established commodity in the NBA and a more established player in the NBA, and his greatness was cemented. I would have thought that David Falk would have certainly leveraged that as well with the Chicago Bulls and forced their hand a little bit earlier in Michael's career as a player. And again, one of the other things I want to talk about as well from a branding standpoint and going back a little bit, and I know that The Last Dance goes back and forth a lot. One of the things I would like to talk about going back is, again, Michael Jordan's impact on sports. This transcends basketball. So at the time, Michael Jordan was representing Chicago sports. And when we study markets, Chicago is the third biggest media market in the United States. That's behind New York and Los Angeles, which makes it one of the most valuable media markets in the world. And this is outside of sports. But when you bring sports into it, Chicago is a very valuable market. So Michael and what he was doing with the Bulls, he was actually carrying the third biggest media market in the United States in general, because other than the 85 Bears when the 85 Bears won the Super Bowl, the 80s were marked with the Chicago teams actually being terrible. So here you have this major market, and they're not very good. And the Chicago Blackhawks are a staple franchise in the NHL. Weren't very good. Obviously, the Cubs are who they are in Major League Baseball. Weren't very good. Didn't have sustained success. Same with the White Sox. And then the Bears after the 85 season. And yeah, they had a couple playoff runs after that. But other than winning the Super Bowl in 85, they didn't really have a lot of dominance. So you have Michael Jordan carrying Chicago sports. Again, the third biggest media market in the United States. So his influence went beyond basketball and it broke into sports in general. He's responsible for the growth of basketball, of course, but he also played a big role in the growth of sports in general. And one of the things that I like to talk about with him playing such a big role in the growth of sports in general was he, in my estimation, Michael sort of became a victim of his own success, because as the growth of sports began to take place while Michael was playing, and again, his success and his dominance certainly played a role in the growth of sports. It created the growth of ESPN to a certain extent. And you start seeing more sports reporters, and you started seeing all of these various outlets that now covered sports because they wanted to ride that Michael Jordan gravy train. So as all of that attention came, Michael started to wilt a little bit under that attention. So we're starting now to see some of those kind of things that we see our modern day athletes deal with in terms of all the pressures that come with playing in a social media era, playing in an era where ESPN, and they joke about this, where they have the Ocho, they almost have 8 different channels where you can watch sports. So that creates reporters, that creates more eyes on your actions. And so Michael was wilting under the very spotlight that he was sort of creating. And I found that to be very interesting. As the better he became, the more influence that he started to exercise, and the more he started to help this sport grow, the more that he started to resent the fact that he was helping this sport grow to a certain extent and helping sports in general grow. And I certainly think that's one of the things, and we saw that with the Jordan rules and the book that was written about, quote unquote, being a teammate of Michael Jordan. And I know that oftentimes we see comparisons between the great Michael Jordan and the great LeBron. And this is one of the things that they sort of share, as these players have been very careful and very smart about building their brands. And of course, LeBron has sort of taken some cues from Michael and exercised more ownership in building his brand, which I applaud LeBron for. But as those two players are starting to build their brands and starting to become more impactful from a cultural standpoint, quite naturally, there's backlash, there's resistance. There's some things that people don't like. They want to go behind the curtain. They want to dig a little deeper to find some things that, quite frankly, they don't like about you. And so the Jordan rules was sort of the inception of that. And now we've seen where teammates, Kevin Durant, who wasn't a teammate of LeBron, but has referenced before saying that because of the amount of attention that comes with being a LeBron James teammate, that the environment becomes toxic for other players. So this is very similar to the Jordan rules. So this is something that both players actually had in common, where someone was talking about and talking negatively about being a teammate of Michael Jordan, just as people talk negatively about being a teammate of LeBron James, even though having both of those players on your team actually helps to raise the level of your ship in the water and brings more attention and brings more opportunities from a branding standpoint as well. I felt like that's one of the things that they both share. Here's another thing that I feel like LeBron and Michael share. When you start looking at telling their stories and brands leveraging their stories at retail and leveraging their stories for monetary gains, it becomes a bigger story. It becomes something to leverage and to make money off of even more when you have Michael and LeBron both having success in their original respective teams, Chicago and Cleveland, both of them leaving, Michael retiring and going and playing baseball, LeBron going to Miami, and then both of them coming back home, per se, LeBron coming back to Cleveland, grew up 30 minutes down the road from in Akron, and Michael, coming home for the Bulls and both delivering championships. So with that being said, now when you have these two entities, Michael and LeBron, having success, leaving, and when they left, the perception is that they burned bridges and they weren't going to return, to ultimately return home and deliver on those championship promises that they had given through their talents, not through their words, but through their talents. Those now become bigger stories that brands can now leverage and tell, and people and connect with consumers at retail. So I felt like that's another thing that both of those players also shared. And then lastly, before I let you go, Hoop Fam, and I appreciate you joining me on the journey, I certainly want to talk about the Dream Team and how that came about. And I talked a lot on last week. I went live and talked about Michael and Isaiah and a lot of the similarities, even though people like to make them as if they're so different. But the similarities are the things that speak to me the most as a player and as a fan of both players as well. And when you look at that team was so important. And I want to talk about Isaiah for a little bit. That Dream Team was so important to Isaiah because from an accomplishment standpoint, he certainly should have been on that team. And there's one other player that I'd like to mention, and then I go back to Isaiah, who should have been on that team as well from an accomplishment standpoint. And you can make a case that he may be the most underrated NBA player of all time. That's the great Dominique Wilkins. And that's another story for another day. He should have been on that team as well, but nonetheless, he was not on that team. But going back to Isaiah, that 92 Dream Team was so important because in 1984, when Michael won his first gold medal, the NBA players were not on the Olympic teams then. We went with our college players. So that was Michael, and that was Patrick Ewing, etc. They were still, and Michael was just about to start in the NBA. And so they were still college players and had not played in NBA for that 1984 team that played in that played and won the gold medal in Los Angeles. And Michael was great for that team. His presence meant a lot for that team as well, and the growth of the sport of basketball. And it was also a great launching point for Michael as well. Well, Isaiah was already in the NBA, so he couldn't play on the 1984 team. And he could not play on the 1980 team. He was in college in 1980 at Indiana because he won the 1981 national championship at Indiana. But he was not on that 1980 team because there was no 1980 team, because the games were held in Moscow and the United States government decided to boycott those games because of the Cold War between the United States and Russia and the political ramifications of that. And in '84, the Russian national team actually did not compete in the Olympics in Los Angeles because of the Cold War. And during the '80s, we were at the height of the Cold War. So Isaiah did not play on the 1980 team, and he was not in college in 1976. So Isaiah in Montreal. So Isaiah did not have the chance to compete on the '80 team. '84, he was a professional. '88, we were still going with college players, and that's the '88 Olympics. And Isaiah was a professional there, about right on the cusp of starting to win championships. So the '92 team represented Isaiah's chance to get a gold medal, which of course would have completed his career. He would have been one of the few players in the world that's won an NCAA championship, a basketball gold medal, and an NBA championship. And so Magic, of course, won his in '92. So he completed that. Of course, Michael did it as well. So with that being said, got a question. I want to answer this one. Yes, I appreciate you for the lab reaching out about Shaq being on that '92 team. Shaq should have absolutely been on that '92 team. But here's the thing about Shaq. When the one college player was chosen, and I used to say this as well, when I would watch that team, of course, Shaq should have been the college player. But when that one college player was chosen, that '92 team, and it's going to bring me to another player I want to talk about. That '92 team at the center spot featured David Robinson and Patrick Ewing. So you have two all-time greats playing on that team. Christian Laettner was selected to be on that team. And if you watch that team a lot, Christian Laettner being the one college player, and a great college player. So I don't want this to sound as if I'm disrespecting the legacy of Christian Laettner. Great college player at Duke. Hoop fam, look him up, look up his stats. All-time leading scorer in NCAA tournament history. Had a great college career. But when they put that team together, and of course that coincided with Shaq's coming into his rookie year. When they put that team together, you have David Robinson and Patrick Ewing as the centers. If they would have selected Shaq over Christian Laettner, there was no way that they could have played Shaq in the role that they played Christian Laettner on that team. Christian Laettner was on that team. It was valuable seasoning to be prepared for the NBA. But make no mistake about it, he was on that team in a total support and ancillary role. He barely played on that team. There was no way that if they put Shaquille O'Neal on that team, and it was made evident by his dominance going into his rookie year as a player and what he did to Patrick Ewing and David Robinson. Of course, they had success as well because they're great players. But what Shaq did to them going into his rookie year, there was no way that if they brought Shaq on that team and replaced Christian Laettner with Shaq, there's no way that they could have used Shaq in the capacity in which they used Christian Laettner, because his performances in the practices would have warranted he would have had to have played. I don't think they wanted to create that problem. And so in my estimation, that's why Shaq wasn't on that dream team. Again, that's my theory. I don't have that from Rod Thorne, but that's just my theory as to why Shaq wasn't on that team. But so again, back to Isaiah talking about the importance of that '92 team. That was his opportunity to win that gold medal. And because of the politics at the highest level, and one thing I'll say, Hoop fam, and we see these politics not only on the floor, but we see these sometimes in coaching hires, front office hires, etc. The assumption is once we get to the pros and once we get to that professional level, it's the ultimate meritocracy, meaning that the opportunities only go to the best. And quite frankly, if it were that easy, a lot of things would be a lot simpler. And it doesn't work like that oftentimes. And there are a lot of political things that happen, a lot of things that don't have anything to do with basketball merit, in terms of why decisions are being made and why players on certain teams and why certain coaches get jobs or why certain GMs get jobs, etc. So there's a lot of, when you are working in a multi-billion-dollar industry, you start to find early that there's not a lot of happenstance, meaning there aren't a lot of things that are left to chance. And there also aren't a lot of things that are meritocracy as well. So, with Isaiah not being on that team, and his merits certainly said he should have been on that team, that was his opportunity to get that gold medal that he ultimately did not win. And so for a player that's so accomplished, who is in the top 15 or so, 20 or so players of all time, who is probably, as MJ so eloquently said, the second greatest point guard that ever lived, for him to not be on that team and still be a great player is probably one of the travesties of United States basketball, I would say. And then going back to David Robinson again, that 92 Olympics was very important for him as well, because he was on the 88 team. So that was the last team that featured college players. And that was a team that underachieved, for our standards, they underachieved. And that team was coached by the great John Thompson. And if you know me, Georgetown was sort of my dream school, and I wanted to go play for John Thompson. So that was a painful moment for me to watch them in 88 not win the gold, and watch John Thompson not get that gold medal as well. So now with David Robinson sort of getting that gold medal in 92, that was his opportunity to atone for 88. So that team represented a lot for David Robinson as well. So he was a guy that didn't win a national championship in college, but won an MVP in the NBA, won NBA championships, and his NBA championships came after he won his gold medal, and then he won a gold medal as well. So a huge accomplishment for the great David Robinson as well. I got a question for is that question, Stu, is that question, how much of it was self-inflicted? Is that for in reference to Isaiah? Appreciate the question. So I'll keep talking while you're typing here. But no, it's so that, okay, yep, so that question was in reference to Isaiah. I think if you look at the question was how much of it was self-inflicted that Isaiah wasn't on that 92 team. If you listen to all of the other great players that were on that team that felt like the mood and the camaraderie would have been negatively impacted if Isaiah were on the team, then I guess you can say that was self-inflicted. But I also offer this, Stu, and I'm thank you again for asking that question. I also offer this, and I can say this as a point guard. Maybe I'm being partial to Isaiah because I'm a point guard. What it takes to be a great player at that level, at Isaiah's size, you almost have to get under the skin of other players. You almost have to be disruptive of their comfort zones if you want to have that type of impact. And of course, as all of these players, and it's competitive as ever, and all of these players are reaching for that one thing, which is that title, it's inevitable that you will probably ruffle some feathers or make some people uncomfortable or challenge some people as you're trying to establish your dominance as well. If you make it similar to, if you want to sort of tie it to a modern day player, Chris Paul is that guy. If you start going behind the curtain and reading some of the things that people say about Chris Paul, people sort of say the same things about him. And it's partly because of, if you're going to be the size that we are and 6'1" and be in the NBA and be this dominant force, you're going to have to upset the apple cart some. And Chris Paul, again, is probably the player that's closest to Isaiah Thomas in that regard. And Chris Paul has not been fortunate enough to play on to play on a team that Isaiah played on, that had not only great players, because as people sort of talk about Detroit, we all talk about the bad boys and the image and the persona and how tough they were defensively and all those things. But people don't talk about how good these guys were as players. And that's something that I don't think Chris Paul played on a team that had the amount of talent that an Isaiah played on. And of course, Isaiah was the engine that made that team go. But he certainly didn't play on a team that had that type of talent. And he certainly didn't play on a team that had that type of in terms of having that dog in them. That's a phrase that we like to use in basketball. Isaiah's teams had that. And Chris Paul's teams certainly didn't have that persona and certainly didn't have that identity as well. So, yeah, Stu, you're right. Chris Paul's body did betray him in the playoffs. And, so yes, that happened that one time. But all of those other sort of people where you could impose, Isaiah set the tone for that team, and that team imposed their will on the rest of the NBA. Chris Paul's never played on teams that were that way. So certainly one of the points that I would like to reference when you make that comparison between Isaiah and Chris Paul. But Isaiah, when you are a player of our size and you want to go in the NBA and have that type of impact, you certainly are going to make some people mad for sure. No question, Ray, no question. Zeke and Isaiah and Joe Dumars, incredible backcourt. And you nailed it, saying that they're the only backcourt to repeat as final MVPs. They were dogs, no question about that. Love those guys. Loved them. So Hoop Fam, I appreciate you joining me. Definitely appreciate it. We'll do this again soon. So certainly hope that you all join me in watching the next 2 episodes of The Last Dance. Thank you for taking that journey with me. Appreciate you guys listening to me. Hope you all are staying healthy and safe. And let's talk again soon, Hoop Fam. Thank you.